He did not scream when they found him. He was already dead before the dog started barking. Welcome back to the Atlas of the Forgotten, where we drag the darkest truths out of the grave and into the light. If you believe the dead deserve to be remembered and the hidden crimes of history should never stay buried, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because tonight we enter a plantation so feared that even its masters began disappearing into the dark one by one. The plantation was called Saint-Varin Estate, a vast sugar empire built deep in the wet lowlands of the French Caribbean in the late 18th century, where endless walls of sugarcane rose taller than a man, and the ground itself seemed to sweat under the crushing heat of the sun. And if a stranger stood at the edge of those fields and listened carefully, he would hear three sounds before anything else: the endless scrape of cane blades cutting through stalks, the groaning thunder of the sugar mill grinding day and night, and the sudden sharp crack of a whip somewhere in the distance, followed by silence, because on Saint-Varin, silence was as important as labor, and fear was worked into the soil as deeply as sugar. And among the hundreds of enslaved Africans forced to survive there, fear had many faces, but none more hated than the overseers, the men who moved between the cane rows on horseback with pistols at their belts and leather whips hanging from their wrists, men who carried out the will of the plantation owner with such cold cruelty that many of the enslaved believed they were more monstrous than the master himself. And at Saint-Varin, the first of these men to truly be feared was a broad-shouldered overseer named Marcel Duray, a former soldier from the islands who took pleasure in punishment the way other men took pleasure in drink. And he was known for making examples of people in public, for choosing the weakest worker in the field and beating him until the others learned to move faster. And on the morning this story truly began. The sun had not yet risen when the conch shell blew, and the field gangs were driven from their huts into the wet dawn, where they were counted, inspected, and divided like cattle before being sent into the cane under torchlight. And among them walked men and women with names stolen from older worlds and older kingdoms, names still carried in whispers despite the plantation's effort to erase them. Names like Zanu, Cambon, Iyele, Faduma, Sogolon, Barika, and Golo, and a quiet man called Tazari, who moved through the fields with lowered eyes and a patient silence that made him almost invisible to the white men who ruled the estate. Though among the enslaved, he was known as someone who saw more than he said, someone who remembered details others ignored, someone whose calm face hid a mind always listening, always measuring, always surviving. And that morning, Tazari was cutting cane near the eastern ditch when Marcel Duray rode past the workers searching for weakness like a jackal searching for a limping animal. And before long he found it in an elderly man named Kafele, who had already worked too many harvests, and whose body had begun to fail him in the heat, because when Kafele paused to steady himself after coughing blood into the dirt, Duray dismounted without a word and struck him across the shoulders, so hard the old man fell face first into the mud, and instead of letting him rise, the overseer stepped on his back and forced the others to keep cutting, while Kafele struggled to breathe beneath his boot. And when a younger woman named Ayel dropped her blade and cried out in protest, Duray turned his rage on her as well, dragging her by the hair through the cane rows before ordering her tied to the punishment frame beside the mill where all could see her at midday. And this was the rhythm of Saint-Varin. Not occasional cruelty, but daily, systematic, organized brutality, because the plantation had been built not only on forced labor, but on terror designed to break memory itself. And the punishments were chosen carefully to humiliate, to isolate, and to erase any idea that those enslaved there had once belonged to nations, clans, and families older than the plantation's owner could even imagine. Yet for all its outward order, Saint-Varin carried a rot beneath its polished image, because strange things had begun happening months before the morning Marcel Duray disappeared. And though the master of the estate dismissed them as superstition, the enslaved had noticed patterns the white men pretended not to see. Tools left carefully arranged in impossible places, hoofprints stopping at the edge of swamp water with no return trail, dogs refusing to enter certain corners of the cane at dusk, and one particular section of the plantation, near the old drying sheds where even the boldest overseers avoided going after sunset because too many strange sounds came from there at night. Low knocking sounds beneath the earth, chains dragging where no one was visible. And once, according to one terrified stable boy, the sound of someone laughing softly beneath the floorboards of an abandoned storage house that had been locked for years. And still the plantation functioned because sugar demanded movement and profit demanded denial. So the owner, a hard-faced widower named Auguste Bellemare, ignored the growing unease among his men and increased punishments instead, believing that fear could crush rumor the way the mill crushed cane. But fear is a dangerous tool because once it turns, it never returns to the hand that used it cleanly. And by the time the sun reached its highest point that day, the plantation was boiling with heat and tension, as Iel hung bloodied at the punishment frame and Cafel lay barely conscious in the shade of the boiling house while Durette strutted through the yard like a king of suffering, mocking the enslaved and warning them that any whisper of escape or rebellion would end with bodies swinging from the tamarind tree at the road. And yet even as he shouted these threats, there were eyes watching him from every corner of the estate. Not with open rage, but with something colder and more dangerous, because Saint-Varin was full of people who had learned that survival sometimes required silence until the right moment. And among them, Tazari noticed something no one else seemed to notice, which was that Durette kept glancing toward the western cane near the swamp line where the ground dipped and the reeds grew too thick to cross easily. And at first, Tazari thought little of it, until later that evening when one of the younger stable hands whispered that Duray had been secretly searching the old marsh paths for something over the past week, sometimes alone, sometimes with a lantern after dark, and no one knew why, though there were rumors among the enslaved that years earlier several people had been buried alive somewhere beyond that part of the field after a failed escape attempt that the plantation owner had ordered erased from the records. And such stories were common on estates like Saint-Varin, where truth was often hidden under cane ash and swamp mud. But what mattered was not whether every whisper was true, but that the overseers themselves had begun acting like men who feared being watched. And that night, the fear became flesh, because after sunset, Duray took 2 dogs, a pistol, and a lantern, and rode out alone despite the storm clouds gathering over the lowlands, telling the gate guard he would be back before the moon rose, and no one saw him alive again. The rain began just after a full dark, a warm, hard rain that flattened the cane and turned the pathways into rivers of black mud. And inside the slave quarters, people lay awake listening to the storm strike the roofs while the mill groaned on through the night like a wounded beast. And sometime near midnight, the dogs started barking, not from the kennels, but from the far western edge of the estate where the swamp met the cane. And their barking did not sound excited like hunting dogs on a trail, but wild and broken, full of panic, as if whatever they had found was not prey, but terror itself. And the guards did not go at first because no one wanted to leave shelter in that weather. But by dawn, Duray still had not returned, and even Bellemare could no longer ignore it. So a search party was sent out with torches and rifles, pushing through the wet cane in a widening line while the enslaved were forced to keep working close enough to watch but too far to hear clearly. And then the searchers stopped all at once near the old drainage ditch by the western swamp where the dogs had circled all night. And one of them dropped his torch and crossed himself before shouting for the others. And by the time the body was dragged back to the yard, every face on the plantation had changed, because Marcel Duray was dead, and not from accident or animal attack or drunken foolishness, but from something deliberate and intimate and terrifying. For he had been found lying on his back in shallow black water, with his lantern extinguished beside him, his boots missing, his pistol still tucked into his belt, unfired. And around his neck someone had tied the very same braided punishment cord he used when hanging field workers by their wrists from the tamarind tree. But that was not what made even the guards go pale, because across his chest, carved slowly and with chilling patience through his soaked shirt and into the skin beneath, was a single symbol none of the white men recognized, but several of the oldest Africans did, though they said nothing. And the symbol looked less like a random mark than a message, a sign from another world or another memory. And when Bellemere demanded to know who had done it, no one answered, because no one truly knew. Yet all across Saint Varin that morning a terrible new understanding passed silently from one enslaved face to another. Someone had begun hunting the overseers, and whoever it was knew exactly how to turn the plantation's own instruments of cruelty back against the men who used them. And from that moment onward, Saint Varin was no longer just a plantation built on fear. It had become a place where fear itself had changed masters. By the second night, after Marcel Duray's body was dragged from the swamp, Saint Varin estate had changed in a way none of the white men wanted to admit aloud, because though the cane was still cut, the mill still roared, and the conch shell still blew before dawn, the plantation no longer moved with the arrogant confidence of men who believed themselves fully in control, but instead with the twitching tension of a place being watched by something patient and unseen. And nowhere was that change more visible than in the behavior of the remaining overseers, who now walked in pairs, checked their pistols more often, drank harder after sunset, and avoided certain corners of the estate where before they had strutted like kings, while the enslaved, though still forced into labor under the same brutal routines, began noticing details they had once been too afraid to hold in their minds for long, because fear had shifted, and with it came a dangerous clarity. And among all those who noticed the change, none watched more carefully than Tazari, the quiet man from the Eastern Field Gang, whose silence had long protected him by making white men think he was simple or broken, when in truth he had survived Saint Varin precisely because he remembered everything. Every route through the cane, every crack in the mill walls, every hidden drainage ditch, every guard shift, every careless conversation, spoken too close to the boiling house where enslaved workers were assumed not to understand French or Creole, when in fact many understood far more than they revealed. And Tazari had learned over the years that a plantation did not truly function on the authority of the master or the violence of the overseers, but on hidden systems beneath the visible ones, on the routes by which food moved from storehouse to field, on the channels by which water was diverted from river to wheel, on the routines by which chains were counted and doors locked and lantern oil distributed, and most of all on the assumption that the enslaved did not know enough to break those systems, which was the greatest lie Saint Varin had ever told itself, because if there was one truth the masters worked hardest to hide, it was that the plantation survived only because Africans with skills, memories, and intelligence far older than the estate itself kept it alive every single day. And Tazari was one of those men, though Bellemere and his overseers saw only a laborer with scarred shoulders and quiet eyes, never suspecting that before capture he had belonged to a river people whose elders taught not only hunting and farming, but also how to read the shape of land, the pull of water, and the language of silence, And those teachings, buried under years of forced labor, had not died in him. They had simply become tools of survival, and so while panic spread through the white quarters after Duray's death, Duray moved through the plantation with his usual calm, cutting cane by day, carrying loads by dusk, and listening always, because he knew the death of one overseer did not happen by chance, and because he had begun to sense that Sam Varon was built on secrets older and darker than most of the enslaved even understood. Secrets hidden not in books or ledgers, but in the land itself. In the old sections of the estate, the master rarely visited, and the guards pretended not to remember, and it was in one of those forgotten corners, near the old drying sheds west of the mill where the ground sloped toward the marsh, and the reeds grew taller than a horse, that Duray had first noticed the signs months earlier. Signs so small they would mean nothing to anyone who had not spent years watching how the estate breathed, but to him they were impossible to ignore. Disturbed soil where no recent work had been ordered, scraps of old iron half buried beneath vine roots, and once, after heavy rain, the brief outline of what looked like a narrow sunken path appearing in the mud before the sun dried it away again. And when he followed that path with his eyes, he saw it disappeared beneath the warped floorboards of an abandoned curing shed that had supposedly been closed since a roof collapse years earlier, though no one ever explained why its door remained chained from the outside despite there being no supplies stored within, and because curiosity was dangerous at Sam Varon. Duray said nothing then, but he never forgot it. And now, after Duray's death, the memory returned with a greater weight, because he had also overheard enough fragments over the years to suspect that the western side of the plantation concealed something Belamir's family had spent a long time trying to bury. And the first clear clue came not from a white man, but from one of the oldest enslaved women on the estate, a bent herbal healer named Sogolon, whose hands trembled with age, but whose mind remained sharp as cane steel. And one evening, as she cleaned Yale's half-healed back with crushed leaves in warm water behind the women's huts, she spoke in a low voice without looking up, saying that men like Duray did not simply vanish unless old debts had come due. And when Duray asked what debts she meant, she stared at him for a long moment before whispering that there were bones beneath Sam Varon that had never been counted and names the plantation owner had erased because dead Africans were easier to forget than living ones. And though she refused to say more where others might hear, the words lodged deep in Duray's mind, because in every slave society there were things deliberately hidden not only from outsiders, but from the newly arrived themselves. Histories of failed rebellions, mass punishments, poisonings, betrayals, and executions so brutal that owners preferred to destroy records rather than risk their own reputations being stained if officials ever investigated too closely. And Sam Varon, with its swamp edges and isolated cane roads, was exactly the kind of place where such crimes could vanish beneath mud and profit. And over the next few days, Duray began watching the western quarter more carefully, noticing that Belamir himself rode there twice in secret after dusk, once accompanied by the estate bookkeeper, and once by an armed overseer named Lucenne Morell, a lean, vicious man whose cruelty was quieter than Duray's, but in many ways more dangerous, because he enjoyed making people disappear through paperwork and punishment rather than public spectacle. And both times, Belamir returned angry and unsettled, his boots caked in swamp mud, while Morell ordered the old curing shed nailed shut more firmly and forbade any enslaved person from working near the drainage ditch after sundown, which only sharpened Duray's suspicion that whatever was hidden there mattered deeply to the plantation's owners. And because he knew open investigation would get him killed, he did what enslaved people across the Atlantic world had always done when truth was hidden behind violence. He built knowledge in pieces, speaking quietly to those who had survived longest and remembered most. And so during the next Sunday rest period, when field labor briefly slowed and people gathered in small clusters to wash clothes, patch sandals, and pretend exhaustion was rest, Duray sat near Cambon, a one-eyed cooper who repaired sugar barrels and had been on Saint Varin longer than almost anyone still living. And after a long, careful silence, Cambon finally admitted that years before, when Belamir's father still ran the estate, a large group of newly arrived Africans had been kept in holding pens near the western sheds after a ship delivery, and among them had been men from warrior lineages and women who refused to bow or eat. And when several tried to organize an uprising before they were fully sorted into gangs, the response from the estate had been so savage that even hardened drivers were shaken because the rebels were not publicly hanged as examples, but instead taken away at night under orders that no record be written. And the next week, the old drainage trench near the swamp had been filled and rerouted under the pretense of improving flood control, after which the western sheds were declared unsafe and abandoned. And though Cambon never saw the bodies himself, he heard enough from the men forced to dig that he believed many were buried alive there after torture. And when Duray asked why no one spoke of it, Cambon gave the only answer Saint Varin ever truly had for anything. Because speaking did not bring the dead back, and because surviving one more season often demanded swallowing truths too heavy to carry openly. Yet for Duray, this hidden history changed everything. Because if the plantation had indeed buried rebels in secret beneath the western quarter, then Duray's death was no random act of revenge, but perhaps the continuation of a memory the estate had failed to kill, and the carved symbol found on his chest, though the whites did not recognize it, might not have been a threat invented in the present at all, but a sign carried from older homelands and older oaths. And this possibility deepened after Duray saw something else Belamir wanted hidden. One rainy evening, while delivering cane tools to the mill shed, he passed the office where the plantation ledgers were kept, and heard Belamir arguing furiously with the bookkeeper about missing pages from the old labor registry, accusing someone of theft. And when the men stormed out to continue searching another room, Duray slipped close enough to glimpse the open ledger on the desk where several entries had indeed been cut cleanly from the binding. But on the torn edge, one name fragment remained visible beside a notation in faded ink. Transferred to Western Hold, no baptism entered. And below it another word partly blotted by age that looked like discipline. And though it was only a fragment, it confirmed what Duray had begun to suspect, that the plantation had once kept a hidden category of captives apart from the normal labor force, people considered too dangerous to record honestly, and if some memory or descendant force. People considered too dangerous to record honestly, and if some memory or descendant of that buried resistance still moved through Saint Varin now, then the disappearances might be less ghost story than unfinished justice. And from that day, Duray's attention sharpened into purpose, because he realized the greatest secret Saint Varin tried to hide was not simply that men had died there for every plantation killed, but that some of the enslaved had once fought back in ways so organized and terrifying that the owners had chosen silence over confession. And if that truth resurfaced, it could poison the entire illusion on which Belamir's authority rested. And so while the estate tightened security, and the overseers drank themselves into false bravery, Duray began preparing himself to go where no one was supposed to go, into the western quarter after dark, toward the abandoned curing shed and the buried ditch beyond it, because whether the hunter stalking the overseers was one man, several, or something larger than any single person, he knew now that Saint Varan was not merely haunted by fear, but by memory, and memory, once awakened, was often more dangerous than fire. The second overseer vanished 4 nights after Tazari learned what Cambon and Sogolon had long carried in silence, and unlike Marcel Duray, whose body had at least been returned to the plantation as a warning, this disappearance was at first so quiet and so ordinary in its beginning that Saint Varan almost failed to understand what had happened until the absence itself became impossible to deny, because Lucenne Morell, the lean, hard-eyed overseer who had helped Bellemere seal the western quarter, and whose punishments were often more terrifying than open beatings because they came with planning, paperwork, and private cruelty, was last seen at dusk inspecting the chain collars kept in the punishment room beside the mill where runaways and so-called troublemakers were sometimes locked upright through the night until their legs gave out beneath them. And he had been in a foul mood all day after one of the field gangs came in short on cane bundles due to a sudden storm. So he spent the evening venting his anger on the weakest bodies available, slapping a young boy named Mfumu hard enough to split his lip for carrying water too slowly, and then dragging a woman named Barika by the elbow into the storehouse because he claimed she had hidden cassava peelings for her sick sister, though everyone knew Morell often used theft as an excuse to isolate women where no witnesses could intervene. And by the time darkness settled over the estate and the mill fires turned the yard red and smoky, several enslaved workers had noticed that Morell kept glancing toward the western quarter with a nervousness he tried badly to hide, because after Duray's death, the man had become obsessed with proving to Bellemere that he was not afraid. And yet fear had entered him all the same, like rot entering a beam. And the whites of Saint Varan had responded to that fear not with wisdom, but with more violence, more patrols, more random searches of sleeping huts, more public punishments meant to force information out of people who had none to give. And in the 2 days before Morell disappeared, he had personally overseen the hanging of an elderly driver named Gay from the tamarind tree after accusing him of spreading jungle tales among the workers, though the man had only warned children not to wander near the old ditch after dark, and the body had been left hanging until noon to harden the lesson, while Bellemere ordered every lantern on the estate counted nightly and every cutting blade returned under guard, as if terror could be solved through inventory. But such measures only deepened the plantation's unease, because the enslaved now moved with a tense alertness that white men misread as submission when it was in truth the opposite. And Tazari, watching all of this while maintaining his practiced silence, understood that Saint Varan was becoming a battlefield of nerves where the unseen hunter was winning without needing to strike often, and nowhere was that more visible than Morell himself, who began sleeping with a pistol beneath his pillow and refusing to cross the western lane alone, though by day he still performed cruelty with all the confidence of a man trying to convince himself he remained untouchable. And so when he announced just before nightfall that he intended to search the abandoned curing shed personally and drag the swamp devil out by the neck, the other overseers laughed too loudly, and Bellemere encouraged him with rum and pride, because men like them often mistook recklessness for courage, and Tazari, who heard this from the shadows while carrying cane hooks back to the tool rack, felt something tighten in his chest, not from fear for Morell, but from the sense that the plantation had just stepped into a trap already prepared long before any of them understood its shape. And as night deepened, and the workers were driven toward their quarters under armed watch, Tazari remained alert, listening to the rhythms of the estate, the way he had learned to do in Africa and refined under slavery. noting which guards stayed close to the main yard, which dogs barked toward the swamp, which doors opened and shut. And near full dark he saw Morell, indeed, set out alone despite his earlier boasting, carrying a hooded lantern, a pistol, and a short cavalry blade at his side, his horse snorting nervously as he rode toward the western sheds where the wind pushed the cane into whispering waves, and the old drainage ditches gleamed like black scars beneath the moon. And then for a long while nothing happened, except the ordinary sounds of Saint Varan at night, the creak of the mill wheel slowing, the distant coughs from the huts, the frogs beginning in the marsh, until somewhere beyond the curing shed one of the dogs let out a single strangled yelp, and then went abruptly silent. And though no alarm was raised immediately, several people heard it and lay awake afterward, including Tazari, who stared into the darkness of his hut and knew with the certainty of instinct that another move had been made in the hidden war now unfolding across the plantation. And by dawn, Morell had not returned, and unlike after Duray's disappearance, the whites reacted faster this time, sending armed riders before the conch even blew. But speed did not help them, because by mid-morning the horse was found first, wandering near the swamp line with its reins dragging and its flanks smeared in blood, not from any deep wound but from shallow cuts, as if it had bolted through cane and thorn in panic. And farther on they found Morell's lantern smashed carefully beneath the roots of a kapok tree, the oil drained out in a dark stain as though someone had extinguished not only the light, but the symbol of his authority. And then the searchers found something that made even the hardest among them go pale. Hanging from the branch above the broken lantern was one of Morell's keys, the iron key to the punishment room collar rack, tied there with a strip of torn white linen, and turning slowly in the breeze like a mocking little bell. And by the time the body itself was discovered, the entire estate was vibrating with dread, because Morell had not drowned, and he had not simply been shot or stabbed in a quick struggle. No, whoever took him had understood him, had chosen a death built from the very tools of fear he had used on others, for he was found inside the abandoned curing shed itself after the door was forced open, standing upright in the darkness with his wrists chained above his head to one of the old roof beams, his boots gone, his mouth stuffed with damp cane fiber, so he had died without screaming loudly enough to be heard beyond the storm wind, and around his neck hung a rusted iron collar from the punishment room, locked tight enough to bruise the skin purple, while beneath him on the dirt floor someone had arranged old account slips, cane tally fragments, and scraps of torn ledger paper into a neat circle soaked dark with blood, as if making a ritual of the plantation's own bookkeeping. And carved into the beam beside his head, using what looked like a cane knife or cooper's blade, was the same symbol found on Duray's chest, only this time larger and deeper, and beside it another mark that some of the oldest Africans recognized but refused to name in front of whites, and Bellemere, when he saw the scene, nearly lost control of himself entirely, shouting that no slave could be clever enough for this and demanding names from anyone within reach, which led to one of the darkest nights Saint Varan had yet seen, because his terror immediately turned outward into punishment, and before sunset 6 men from different field gangs were dragged to the yard and whipped until 2 collapsed, not because there was evidence against them, but because Bellemere needed pain to answer what he could not understand, while the women's huts were searched, hidden food stores destroyed, and every child over 10 counted twice. And through it all, the enslaved endured in that terrible way only the oppressed often can, storing rage behind still faces, helping the wounded in secret, and watching as the white world around them began to crack under pressure, because now it was no longer possible to dismiss the disappearances as accident or rumor. The hunter was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly intimate in his knowledge of the plantation, And if Duray's death had planted fear, Morell's death made that fear intelligent, for it proved the killer understood not only the estate's geography, but its records, its punishments, its hidden rooms, and perhaps its buried history too. And for Duray, this changed his role from observer to participant in ways he had not yet chosen, but could no longer avoid. Because as the estate spiraled deeper into paranoia, he began noticing that the clues left behind were not random signs of madness, but messages arranged with a precision someone like him could read if he dared. The broken lantern under the kapok roots, the key displayed before the body, the circle of torn ledger scraps, all of it suggesting that the overseers were not simply being killed, but judged, and judged according to crimes tied to the plantation's hidden archives and forgotten dead. And this suspicion sharpened dangerously that same night, when Sogolon, while cleaning blood from one of the whipped men, whispered to Duray that the symbol carved near Morell's body was older than the plantation and belonged to a warning used by certain river and forest peoples when blood debt remained unpaid, a sign not merely of revenge but of unfinished accounting between the living and the buried. And before he could press her for more, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength and told him in a low voice that if he wanted truth, he must go beneath the western shed before the whites did, because once Bellemere understood that something there connected to the deaths, he would burn the whole quarter down, rather than let anyone see what Saint-Varin had hidden. And with those words, the fear surrounding the plantation became, for Duray, something even heavier than danger. It became urgency. Because now the overseers were dying one by one. The master was lashing out blindly, and somewhere beneath the cane and mud lay the secret that explained not only the hunt, but the history the estate had murdered to keep buried. And as the moon rose over Saint-Varin that night, and the surviving overseers barred their doors and slept with loaded pistols beside their beds, Duray lay awake, knowing the plantation entered a darker stage from which there would be no return, because whoever was hunting the men of Saint-Varin had not finished, and the next disappearance would almost certainly drag the whole estate into blood. The night after Lucenne Morell was found standing dead in the abandoned curing shed, chained like one of the very people he had spent years tormenting, Saint-Varin no longer felt like a plantation to those trapped inside it, but like a graveyard pretending to be a business. Because even though the cane still had to be cut, and the mill still had to turn, every sound now carried a second meaning, and every shadow seemed to hold breath. And Duray understood with painful clarity that if the truth beneath the western quarter was not uncovered quickly, it would either be destroyed by Bellemere or buried again beneath even more blood. So he waited through the long day of forced labor while the estate staggered under its own panic, and the master barked orders at armed men who were now too frightened to patrol alone. And by sunset he had made his choice, not because he believed himself fearless, but because he knew history was always most vulnerable in the hours before power tries to erase it. And so that night, after the final count, and after the hut rows had gone quiet except for the occasional cough or muffled sob, he slipped from the rear of the sleeping quarters and moved low through the darkness, with the same patient care he once used while stalking antelope in the forests of his youth, avoiding the lantern glow near the yard and circling wide through the cane where the stalks whispered against his shoulders and the wet earth sucked softly at his feet. And though the moon was half covered by clouds, he knew the western quarter by memory now, by the smell of the marsh and the sag of the ground and the faint shape of the old drying sheds ahead. And when he reached the abandoned curing shed, he found what he feared most and expected least. Someone had already been there after Morell's death, because the door Bellemere's men had forced open earlier was now hanging crooked, and one of the floor planks inside had been pried loose and left leaning against the wall, as if in their panic They had searched quickly but not deeply enough to understand what they were looking at, and Tazari dropped to his knees and lifted the plank fully away, revealing a narrow cavity beneath the floor where damp air rose from below, carrying the smell of mold, stagnant water, old wood, and something else harder to name but impossible to mistake once known, the sweet sour ghost of long decayed death. And with a strip of cloth wrapped around his hand and a stolen lantern wick hidden in a clay shard, he lowered himself into the darkness where the earth narrowed into a low tunnel, not natural but dug, reinforced in places with rotting beams and old barrel staves, and almost immediately he understood that this was no simple storage crawlspace, but part of an older hidden structure connected to the plantation's earliest years, a place built to conceal movement or confinement. And as he crawled deeper, he found rusted chain links half sunk in the mud, fragments of broken shackles, a child's carved bead, and then a section where the tunnel widened into a chamber low enough to crouch in, but not stand. And there his hand touched bone, not one bone, but many, mixed through the earth where the tunnel floor had partly collapsed into what had once been a pit. And even in the dim light, he could see skulls, ribs, wrists, still trapped in corroded iron, and scraps of cloth fused to the soil by time. And Tazari froze not from fear alone, but from the terrible recognition that Cambon's whispers had not been rumor but mercy compared to the truth, because this was not a burial ground made after ordinary death. It was a hidden killing site, a place where people had been confined and discarded beneath the plantation itself so their names could never rise into record, and the deeper he searched, the more signs he found that these had not all died quickly. Gouges in the old support beams where nails or tools had scraped wood, prayer marks scratched into packed clay, a row of small stone tokens arranged along one wall as if someone had tried to preserve identity in the final hours by making memory physical. And then, in a half-collapsed niche at the rear of the chamber, he found the thing that changed everything, a wrapped oilskin bundle sealed inside a cracked sugar mold and hidden behind a loose brick. And when he opened it, his breath caught, because inside were pages, damp and stained, but still readable in places, along with a carved wooden token bearing the same symbol found on Duray and Morell. And though Tazari could not read all the French script on the pages, he recognized enough names, dates, and notations from years of watching the bookkeeping room to understand their importance, because this was not plantation record in the official sense, but private accounting, the kind owners kept for themselves when legality and profit needed to be separated. And among the pages were lists of unfit shipments, disciplinary transfers, and special holdings, all attached to the Western Quarter, along with references to containment below, and night removals, signed not by Auguste Bellemare, but by his father, Etienne Bellemare, whose name still lived on Saint-Varin as a kind of founding ghost. And one page in particular made Tazari's stomach tighten, because it described a group of newly arrived captives from several inland and river communities who had resisted branding, refused baptism, and attacked a driver during sorting, after which Etienne ordered that they be separated from common stock and corrected without spectacle, a phrase whose meaning was made horrifyingly clear by the bones around him, and among the listed names, rendered badly in French-hand, by men who neither respected nor understood them, Tazari recognized echoes of African naming forms, still spoken quietly among the oldest enslaved, names like Niarai, Kato, Lembani, Abeni. No, not that, he paused and corrected in his own mind, because what was written was closer to Abani, and also Sefu, Mosi, Kande, and one that struck him hardest because Sogalan had once mentioned it in a half-finished prayer. Tandari, perhaps an ancestor, perhaps a title, perhaps merely a man whose memory had survived only as a sound, and besides several names, the notation, "disposed under trench," appeared in the same cold hand that calculated sugar losses and barrel counts, reducing rebellion, pain, and murder into inventory language. And here at last was the hidden secret St. Varan had tried to bury from history. Not merely that enslaved people had been punished or killed there, which happened across the colonies every day, but that the Bellemere family had built part of its fortune through a concealed extermination of organized resistors too dangerous to leave in the official system, men and women whose very existence threatened the fiction that slavery was stable if discipline was firm. And because their deaths had not been recorded honestly, their descendants, if any survived on neighboring estates or within St. Varan itself, had been robbed not only of kin, but of explanation. And as Duray crouched among those bones, another truth arrived with equal force, which was that whoever was killing the overseers either knew this chamber existed or had learned enough of its story to make the deaths answer it. And perhaps the symbol left on the bodies was not simply a sign of vengeance, but a mark carried down through survivors from those hidden rebels, a coded memory that had endured in songs, scar patterns, whispered warnings, or carved tokens passed hand to hand, despite everything the plantation had done to erase them. And as if to confirm that he was no longer alone in this knowledge, Duray heard the faint scrape of movement behind him in the tunnel, and spun low with a shard of broken iron raised in defense only to see in the lantern's weak glow, not a guard, but Sogalan herself emerging with impossible quiet for a woman of her age, her face set not with surprise but with old grief. And when she saw the bone, she closed her eyes, as though greeting the dead by name before telling him in a voice barely above breath that she had been brought to St. Varan years after the killings, but had tended one dying woman who escaped that underground hole for 2 days before being recaptured. And from her fevered whispers, Sogalan learned that the Bellemeres had once imprisoned a whole cluster of resistors beneath the western quarter after a failed uprising on the dock road, starving some, torturing others for names and routes, and burying many alive when a tropical sickness broke out among them. And the owner feared official inspection more than murder, and according to that woman, one child survived the trench long enough to be smuggled out by an enslaved cooper and hidden on a neighboring estate under a changed name, a child who carried a carved token marked with the same river symbol and who was said to have descendants somewhere in the lowland plantations. And this revelation turned the chamber from a tomb into a fuse, because it meant the revenge unfolding now might not belong to one avenger alone, but to a lineage of memory waiting years to mature into action. And before Duray could ask more, a new danger announced itself above them. Bootsteps on the curing shed floor, and the hard metallic click of a rifle being cocked. And both he and Sogalan froze as Bellemere's voice echoed faintly through the boards with 2 guards beside him, cursing about hidden passageways and ordering the shed burned at first light if nothing useful was found, which meant the truth they had uncovered was only hours from destruction. And in that suffocating darkness among bones, ledgers, and the erased dead, Duray realized the plantation's hidden crime had finally shown its full face. St. Varan was not simply a site of labor and punishment, but a machine built to consume rebellion so completely that even memory itself could be enslaved. And now that machine was failing because the dead had found a way back through the living, and if he wanted the truth to survive long enough to matter, he would have to carry it out of the grave before Bellemere set the whole past on fire. Before dawn could come and erase the evidence beneath the western shed in flame, St. Varan exploded into the kind of chaos that plantation owners always believed happened only on other estates and only to weaker men, because as Bellemere stood above the hidden chamber, With 2 armed guards cursing about smoke, rats, and rebel tricks, Tazari and Sogalan remained crouched beneath the floorboards in the stale dark among bones and ledgers, while every beat of their hearts seemed loud enough to betray them. And then fate, or perhaps the dead themselves, moved faster than any plan either of them could have made, for one of the guards above suddenly cried out in pain and crashed against the warped wall of the shed, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle, boots skidding, wood splitting, a rifle firing once into the roof, and Bellemere shouting in blind fury before another heavy blow silenced him for a moment. And in that instant, Tazari did not hesitate, because years of slavery had taught him the brutal truth that survival belongs to those who move before confusion settles into order. So he shoved the hidden ledger bundle into his shirt, seized Sogalan by the arm, and pushed her toward the rear crawlspace where the tunnel narrowed toward the old drainage line. But before they could fully disappear, the boards above were ripped wide enough for moonlight and smoke to slash into the chamber, and Tazari looked up just long enough to see a silhouette framed in the opening, a broad-shouldered figure wrapped in cane sackcloth and swamp reeds, with a face partly blackened by ash. And though he could not make out every feature, he saw one thing clearly hanging from the stranger's wrist: a carved wooden token bearing the same river mark symbol found on the bodies and in the hidden oilskin bundle. And then the figure whispered in a low, urgent voice, not in French, but in a clipped trade tongue many Africans on the island still used in fragments, saying only, "Take the names, run east, fire comes." Before vanishing again into the struggle above, and a heartbeat later, the entire shed shook as something heavy toppled outside, and flames burst along the front wall where lantern oil had clearly been poured in preparation, because whoever had been hunting the overseers had not merely chosen this night to strike by chance, but had timed the attack with perfect cruelty so that Bellemere's own order to burn the shed would become a trap sprung against him. And as smoke rolled through the tunnel, Tazari and Sogalan crawled hard through mud and root until the passage broke into the old drainage trench where foul black water lapped against their knees and frogs scattered before them. And behind them, the western quarter erupted into alarm as shouts and gunfire tore across the plantation. Bells rang from the yard, dogs barked in terrified bursts, and the first tongues of fire climbed into the humid sky. And though Tazari's first instinct was to get the hidden records to safety, he knew instantly that Saint Véran had crossed a line from secret killing into open war, because the plantation's fear had finally burst its banks, and now everyone would be forced to choose. And by the time he and Sogalan emerged near the cane line, east of the swamp, the whole estate was alive with panic. Guards running in conflicting directions, workers pouring half awake from huts, women clutching children, men grabbing tools that could become weapons in a second if courage outweighed terror, and above it all the western sheds burned bright enough to turn the cane tops copper, while from somewhere near the stables came the scream of a horse and then another gunshot followed by silence. And Tazari, breathing hard and soaked in ditch water, saw Bellemere stagger from the smoke with blood running down one side of his face and one sleeve hanging loose as if his shoulder had been slashed. And in that instant, the plantation owner no longer looked like a god of discipline, but like what he truly was, a frightened old butcher whose authority depended entirely on other men obeying his voice. And that voice was failing him now, because before he could gather his guards, a second blaze erupted near the cane tool house where dry bundles, pitch, and spare timber had been stored, and the fire raced up so quickly it could only have been set deliberately, meaning the attack was broader than one hidden avenger and likely involved hands inside the labor gangs. And all at once, Saint-Véran became a map of collapsing control as the mill workers, already nearest the heat and confusion, began refusing shouted orders, some fleeing toward the marsh while others turned on isolated drivers with cane knives and furnace pokers, and in the women's yard, a chain rack was overturned and used to block one of the patrol paths, while somewhere behind the boiling house someone blew a conch shell in a rhythm not used for work, but for warning, and hearing that sound ripple across the estate did something powerful and terrible to the enslaved, because it transformed fear into memory, memory into possibility, and possibility into action. And Duray watched men who had spent years bending under whips suddenly straighten with a different kind of stillness in their shoulders, the stillness that comes just before either death or freedom. And he understood then that the hidden secret of Saint Varan was not only what the Bellemires had buried beneath the western quarter, but how many times resistance had already tried to live here despite massacre. Because rebellion was not a single event, but a buried root system, waiting for enough heat to crack the ground. And tonight that ground had split open. And with Sogalan urging him not to lose the ledger, he moved fast through the confusion toward the cooper shed where Cambon and two others could be trusted. But halfway there he nearly collided with Iel, the same woman once tied bloody to the punishment frame, now carrying a driver's dropped cutlass with both hands and a look in her eyes colder than fire. And she told him breathlessly that Duret's kennel boy had been found with his throat cut, that two of the estate's bloodhounds were loose and maddened, and that one of the younger overseers, Armand Vu, had locked himself inside the sugar office with the wage chest and records while begging for soldiers from the road station. And before Duray could answer, the office window shattered from within, and a man's scream ripped through the yard, not long and theatrical, but sudden and wet and final. And when several workers rushed close enough to look, they recoiled in stunned silence, because Armand had not merely been stabbed or beaten. He had been pinned to his own ledger table, with an iron tally spike driven through the hand and neck, and spread across the open account books beneath him in thick blood were names copied clumsily but recognizably from the hidden Western records, the names of the buried rebels Bellemire's family had tried to erase. And if any doubt remained then about what this night truly was, that sight ended it, because now the plantation's hidden archive had surfaced in public through violence, turning the owner's private crimes into a visible accusation written across the very books that once reduced human beings to sugar units and labor costs. And Bellemire, seeing the office scene moments later, let out a raw animal sound that was part rage and part terror before ordering every hut searched and every worker found with a blade to be shot. But his commands came too late and too wildly, for the estate was already breaking into zones of separate battle. The mill yard, the hut rows, the western fire line, stable lane, each with its own desperate logic. And in that collapsing order, Duray finally saw the hidden hunter clearly for the first time near the old tamarind tree where Gay had been hanged, not as a ghost, but as a man of flesh and breath moving with brutal purpose through smoke and lantern flare. His face still obscured by ash and cloth, but his posture unmistakably disciplined. And beside him fought not an army, but a handful of people, striking fast and vanishing between structures, as if they had rehearsed the plantation's weaknesses for months. One of them a limping cooper's apprentice, another a woman from the laundry yard, another perhaps the stable hand who once whispered about Duray's late rides, and all of them targeting not random whites, but specific men, specific routes, specific choke points. And Duray understood with a shock that this was not madness or curse, but innovation born under oppression. A resistance network built from observation, memory, and practical knowledge of the estate's hidden arteries. And in another world, such intelligence would have made engineers, commanders, navigators, but slavery had forced it into sabotage and blood. And as the flames spread toward the syrup store and the heat grew so fierce that glass popped in the owner's windows, Bellemere made one final desperate move, ordering the main bell rung continuously to summon neighboring militia from the road, but before the signal could carry far, the rope was cut and the bell jammed mid-peal, leaving Sam Varin suspended in a half-wrung cry like a throat interrupted. And then from the western darkness came a sound that froze even the boldest men still standing. The slow, heavy rhythm of many feet moving through cane in unison. Not an army, perhaps, but enough bodies to suggest that the plantation's revolt was larger than Bellemere had imagined. Enough to convince him that if he stayed until daylight, he might not survive it. And in that moment, Duray had to choose between joining the visible uprising in blood or preserving the buried evidence that could outlive one night's fire. And though every wound in him wanted revenge, he chose the ledger because he understood something the overseers never had, which was that killing men ends bodies, but exposing truth can poison empires. And so as St. Varin became a furnace of scream, smoke, and collapsing power, he led Sogalan and those nearest him toward the eastern marsh path with the names of the dead hidden against his skin, while behind them the plantation entered its bloodiest hour and the hunt for the last overseer had already begun.